The morning rain created tiny rivers down the coffee shop windows as Sarah Martinez wiped down tables with mechanical precision. Her movements were practiced, efficient, the kind that came from 3 years of working the same shift at coastal grounds. The Small sat just outside the gates of Naval Amphibious Base, serving caffeine and comfort to military personnel and their families. Sarah had never planned to work here this long. After graduating with a degree in marine biology, she'd taken the job temporarily while searching for research positions. But temporary had stretched into permanent when her younger brother needed surgery, when rent increased, when life happened the way it always did to people with more dreams than dollars. She tucked a strand of dark hair behind her ear, revealing the edge of an intricate tattoo that wound around her left shoulder and down her arm. Most days, she kept it covered with long sleeves, but the October heat had made that impossible. The design was beautiful and meaningful, though few people ever saw it completely or understood its significance. The bell above the door chimed as a group of men in military fatigues entered, their voices carrying the easy camaraderie of teammates. Sarah glanced up from her cleaning, automatically shifting into customer service mode. She'd served hundreds over the years, learning to read the different uniforms, the various insignia that marked rank and specialty. These men were different. There was something in their bearing, their quiet confidence that set them apart. They moved with the controlled awareness of predators, eyes constantly scanning, even in the safety of a coffee shop. Their conversation was subdued but intense, discussing training schedules and deployment rotations. Commander Jake stood slightly apart from his team, reviewing something on his phone while they debated coffee orders. At 34, he carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions. His dark hair showed the first hints of gray at the temples, and a thin scar ran along his jawline, souvenirs from 15 years of military service. Jake had been a Navy SEAL for over a decade, leading teams through some of the most dangerous missions in modern warfare. He was home between deployments, using the time to train new recruits and decompress from 6 months in hostile territory. The coffee shop had become his team's regular stop during their rare downtime. Sarah approached their table with practiced professionalism, notepad ready. She'd learned to be efficient with military customers. They appreciated quick service and no unnecessary small talk. "Good morning. What can I get started for you?" The younger SEALs placed their orders with the enthusiasm of men who'd been living on MREs and instant coffee. Extra shots, energy drinks, anything with enough caffeine to keep them alert through another day of intense training. Sarah wrote quickly, her movements graceful despite the rushed pace. Jake was the last to order, looking up from his phone to meet her eyes. "Black coffee, large," he said simply, then paused. Something had caught his attention, though Sarah couldn't tell what. As she reached across to collect the menus, her sleeve rode up slightly, exposing more of her tattoo. Jake's trained eye immediately focused on the visible portion. What he saw made his breath catch almost imperceptibly. The tattoo wasn't random artwork or a decorative design. It was a memorial piece, intricately detailed and deeply personal. Jake could see names woven into the design, dates that meant something significant, and symbols that spoke of loss and remembrance. Most telling was a portion that depicted a military dog tag partially hidden among flowing script and delicate roses. Jake's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. After years of military service, he'd learned to read people quickly, and something about this young woman's memorial tattoo struck him as familiar. The style, the specific elements, the way certain names were positioned within the design, all triggered a memory he'd been trying to suppress for months. Sarah noticed his stare and quickly adjusted her sleeve, color rising in her cheeks. She was used to people looking at her tattoo with curiosity or judgment, but there was something different in this man's gaze. It wasn't the usual mixture of interest and disapproval she got from customers. His expression was more complex, almost recognition mixed with something that looked like concern. "I'll have your orders right out," she said quickly, retreating to the safety of the counter. Her hands shook slightly as she prepared their drinks, though she couldn't explain why. The man's intense stare had unsettled her in a way she couldn't define. Jake watched her work, his mind racing through possibilities. The partial view of the tattoo had revealed a name, SGTA Martinez. Below it, a date from 8 months ago. His stomach tightened as pieces of a painful puzzle began fitting together. 8 months ago, Jake's team had been deployed to a classified location where they'd worked alongside Army units in a joint operation. One of those units had included a Sergeant Martinez, a young soldier with infectious optimism and unwavering dedication to his team. Tony had talked constantly about his sister back home, how she was brilliant, studying marine biology, how proud he was of her accomplishments. The operation had gone wrong in the way that haunted Jake's nightmares. Intelligence had been faulty enemy positions. Tony Martinez had died trying to save wounded teammates, his body shielding others from an explosion that should never have happened. Jake had been the one to write the report, to recommend Tony for posthumous honors, to carry the weight of decisions that had led good men into an impossible situation. Now, staring at the young woman behind the counter, Jake saw the resemblance he'd missed before. The same dark eyes, the same determined set to the jaw, the same quiet strength that Tony had possessed. This was Tony's sister, the marine biologist he'd talked about constantly, the person he'd died protecting in the abstract way soldiers protected the future they hoped their sacrifices would preserve. Sarah returned with their coffee, still avoiding eye contact. She set Jake's cup down carefully, professional despite her obvious discomfort. "Anything else I can get for you?" Jake's teammates were already deep in conversation about the day's training exercises, but Jake couldn't focus on anything except the woman in front of him. He needed to know for certain, but approaching the subject required delicacy. Military death notifications were formal affairs, handled through proper channels. If this was Tony's sister, she would have received official word months ago. But Jake carried additional information, details that official reports couldn't capture, words Tony had asked him to remember. "Excuse me," Jake said quietly, his voice pitched low enough that his teammates wouldn't overhear. "I noticed your tattoo. Is it a memorial?" Sarah's eyes flashed with something between pain and anger. She'd dealt with intrusive questions about her tattoo before, usually from people who had no right to ask and no understanding of what it meant. "That's personal," she replied curtly, starting to turn away. "Wait," Jake said, reaching out but not quite touching her arm. "Please, I think I might have known him." The words stopped Sarah cold. She turned back slowly, studying Jake's face with new intensity. The pain in his expression wasn't the casual curiosity of a stranger. It was the deep, complicated grief of someone who'd lost a comrade, who'd been there when it mattered most. "You knew Tony?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. Jake nodded solemnly. "Sergeant Martinez, he talked about you constantly. Said his sister was going to save the ocean someday, that she was the person he'd ever known." Sarah's composure cracked slightly. Hearing Tony's words repeated by a stranger in a coffee shop, 8 months after his funeral, felt surreal and overwhelming. She glanced around quickly, making sure her manager wasn't watching, then sat down heavily in the chair across from Jake. How was all she could manage. Jake looked at his teammates, who were absorbed in their discussion and wouldn't miss him for a few minutes. He turned his full attention to Sarah, weighing how much to say, how much she could handle, how much he was authorized to share. "We worked together on a joint operation. Different branches but same mission," he said carefully. "He was a good soldier. Better than that, he was a good man." Sarah's eyes filled with tears she'd thought were long exhausted. The official notification had been brief and sanitized. Died in service to his country, posthumous Purple Heart, burial with full military honors. But it had told her nothing about who Tony had been in his final months, how he'd lived, what he'd thought about as he served half a world away from home. Was he scared? The question came out before she could stop it, vulnerability replacing her usual composure. Jake considered his answer carefully. Honesty was important, but so was kindness. "He was brave," he said finally. "But not in the way people think. He wasn't fearless. He was afraid of the right things. He was afraid of letting his team down, of not doing enough, of something happening to the people he loved back home. That kind of fear makes better soldiers." Sarah nodded, recognizing the Tony she'd known in Jake's description. Her brother had always been thoughtful, always carried the weight of responsibility heavily. It made sense that his military service had amplified those qualities rather than changed them. "The tattoo," Jake said gently. "It's beautiful. He would have liked knowing you honored him that way." Sarah looked down at her covered arm, thinking about the hours she'd spent with the tattoo artist, planning every detail of the memorial. Tony's name and dates were woven through a design that represented their shared love of the ocean, their childhood spent exploring tide pools and dreaming about underwater worlds. The dog tags were Tony's actual tags, the ones that had been returned with his personal effects. "I got it on what would have been his 25th birthday," she said quietly. "I couldn't afford a headstone that said everything I wanted it to say, but I could carry this with me." Jake understood the impulse. Military families often struggled with the gap between public recognition and private grief. Tony had died a hero in official terms, but Sarah had lost a brother who used to steal her French fries and help her study for chemistry exams. The tattoo was her way of keeping both versions of Tony alive. "He talked about you all the time," Jake said. "About how proud he was, how you'd gotten a scholarship, how you were going to do important work. He said you'd probably end up discovering some new species and naming it after him." Despite her tears, Sarah smiled. That conversation had been one of their last, a video call where Tony had teased her about her research ambitions while simultaneously bragging to his fellow soldiers about his brilliant sister. The memory was precious precisely because it had been so normal, so much like the thousands of conversations they'd had growing up. "I was supposed to start a graduate program last fall," she admitted. "But after Tony died, I couldn't focus on anything. The scholarship money went to funeral expenses, and I've been stuck here ever since." Jake felt the familiar weight of survivor's guilt settling over him. Tony had died protecting the idea of home, the belief that his sacrifice would preserve the future for people like Sarah. To learn that his death had actually derailed her dreams felt like a betrayal of everything Tony had fought for. The coffee shop was getting busier as the morning progressed, and Sarah glanced nervously toward her manager's office. She couldn't sit much longer without attracting unwanted attention, but she wasn't ready for this conversation to end. Connecting with someone who'd known Tony felt like finding a missing piece of a puzzle she'd been trying to solve for 8 months. "I should get back to work," she said reluctantly, standing up slowly. Jake reached into his wallet and pulled out a business card, writing his personal number on the back. "I have some things of Tony's," he said quietly. "Personal items that never made it through official channels, things I think he'd want you to have." Sarah took the card with shaking hands. The idea that pieces of Tony still existed, that there were parts of his final months she hadn't heard about, was both thrilling and terrifying. She thought the official notification and funeral had been the end of the story, the final chapter in Tony's life. Now this stranger was suggesting there might be more. "Why didn't you contact me before?" she asked. Jake's expression darkened slightly. "Military bureaucracy, privacy regulations. I wasn't family, so I had no official standing. And honestly, I wasn't sure if it would help or hurt to reach out. Some families want to move forward, not look back." Sarah understood. The months after Tony's death had been a blur of paperwork, condolence visits, and well-meaning advice about grief and healing. Everyone had opinions about the right way to mourn, the appropriate timeline for recovery, the importance of moving on. Most of it had felt hollow and premature. "Thank you," she said, clutching the card, "for talking to me, for remembering him." Jake stood up as his teammates began gathering their gear, training schedule calling them back to duty. "Sarah," he said, using her name for the first time. "Tony was proud of you before he died. Don't let his sacrifice become the reason you give up on the dreams he believed in." As Jake and his team left the coffee shop, Sarah remained standing beside their empty table, cards still clutched in her hand, mind reeling with possibilities she hadn't dared consider in months. For the first time since Tony's funeral, the future felt like something more than just surviving until tomorrow. The bell chimed again as more customers entered, and Sarah forced herself back into work mode. But throughout the rest of her shift, she found herself glancing at Jake's card, wondering what secrets from Tony's final months were waiting to be discovered, wondering if the chance encounter might be the beginning of something that could change everything. 3 days passed before Sarah found the courage to call the number on Jake's card. Each time she reached for her phone, doubt crept in. What if the conversation had meant more to her than it had to him? What if reaching out seemed desperate or inappropriate? What if learning more about Tony's final months only made the grief worse? But curiosity eventually won over caution. On Thursday evening, after her shift ended and the coffee shop fell quiet, Sarah dialed Jake's number. Her heart hammered as the phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Jake answered on the 4th ring, his voice professional but not unfriendly. "This is Sarah Martinez," she said quickly before she could lose her nerve. "From the coffee shop, you said you had some of Tony's things." There was a brief pause, then Jake's tone warmed considerably. Sarah, I'm glad you called. I was hoping you would. Are you free this weekend? I could bring everything by, or we could meet somewhere if that's more comfortable. Sarah considered her options. Her apartment was small and cluttered, hardly the place to receive a stranger, even one with good intentions. But public places felt too impersonal for something so important. There's a park near the harbor, she said finally. Park near the marina. Would Saturday afternoon work? Absolutely, 2 o'clock. Perfect, and Jake, Sarah hesitated, then pushed forward. Thank you for keeping his things, for thinking they mattered. Everything about Tony mattered, Jake replied simply. I'll see you Saturday. The next 2 days crawled by with agonizing slowness. Sarah found herself distracted at work, burning milk for lattes and forgetting customer orders. She told herself not to build up expectations, not to hope for too much, but her mind kept spinning possibilities. What could Jake possibly have that the army hadn't already returned? What pieces of Tony's story were still missing? Saturday afternoon arrived gray and windy, typical October weather for San. Sarah arrived at park 15 minutes early, choosing a picnic table with a view of the harbor. Sailboats bobbed in the distance while joggers and dog walkers populated the waterfront path. The setting felt appropriately peaceful for what promised to be an emotional conversation. Jake appeared precisely at 2 o'clock, carrying a small duffel bag and looking less imposing in civilian clothes. Jeans and a navy pullover made him seem more approachable, though Sarah could still see the careful awareness in his posture, the way he automatically scanned the area before sitting down. Thanks for coming, Sarah said, suddenly nervous about what was in the bag. Thanks for trusting me, Jake replied, setting the duffel on the table between them. I want to explain something before we start. These items never went through official channels because they weren't exactly regulation. Personal letters, photographs, things soldiers aren't supposed to keep but always do anyway. Sarah nodded, understanding. Tony had always bent rules when it came to staying connected to home. He'd smuggled a cell phone to basic training and hidden care packages from their grandmother under his barracks bunk. Jake opened the bag slowly, revealing its contents with careful ceremony. The first item was a small waterproof notebook, its edges worn from handling. Tony wrote in this almost every day, Jake explained. Letters he was planning to send, thoughts about missions, observations about the country we were in. A lot of it is about you. Sarah accepted the notebook with trembling hands. Tony's handwriting was immediately recognizable, the same messy scrawl that had covered birthday cards and grocery lists throughout their childhood. Seeing it again felt like hearing his voice across an impossible distance. You don't have to read it now, Jake said gently, noticing her emotional response. Take your time with everything, there's no rush. Next came a small digital camera, the kind soldiers often carried to document their experiences. Hundreds of photos, Jake said. Some mission-related, but mostly just life. The people he worked with, places he visited, things that reminded him of home. Then Jake produced a small wooden box, handcrafted and smoothed by careful attention. Tony made this during downtime. He was always working on it, carving details, sanding the surface. He said it was going to be a jewelry box for someone special back home. I think he meant it for you. Sarah traced the intricate patterns carved into the wood, recognizing motifs that echoed her tattoo design. Flowers and waves intertwined around her initials, carved with the patience of someone who had time to kill and love to express. The craftsmanship was beautiful, far better than she would have expected from her mechanically challenged brother. How, she whispered, Tony could barely change a light bulb. Jake smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face. Turns out your brother had hidden talents. One of our interpreters was a woodworker in civilian life. He taught Tony the basics, then Tony practiced obsessively. He worked on that box every free moment for 3 months. The last item in the bag was the most surprising. A thick manila envelope sealed with Tony's signature and dated just 2 weeks before his death. Sarah's name was written across the front in his careful printing, along with instructions, to be delivered only if something happens to me. He gave this to me a month into deployment, Jake explained. Said it was insurance just in case. Most soldiers write letters home before dangerous missions, but Tony was more systematic about it. This is everything he wanted you to know. Sarah stared at the envelope, overwhelmed by the weight of Tony's final words. She treasured their last phone conversation for months, replaying every detail, but now she was holding something more deliberate, more complete. Whatever was inside represented Tony's final thoughts about their relationship and his hope for her future. "I can't open it here," she said finally. "It's too much." Jake nodded understanding. "Of course, take everything home, process it at your own pace. I'm not going anywhere." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching boats navigate the harbor while Sarah absorbed the magnitude of what she'd received. These weren't just mementos. They were proof that Tony had been thinking about her until the very end, planning for her future even while living in constant danger. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah said eventually, "about how he died?" Jake's expression grew serious. "What do you want to know?" "The official report said he died saving other soldiers, but it didn't say how or why he was in position to save them in the first place. I need to understand what really happened." Jake considered his words carefully. Military families deserved honesty, but they also deserved protection from unnecessary trauma. Finding the balance required delicacy. "We were investigating reports of weapons smuggling in a civilian area," he began slowly. "Intelligence suggested the operation was small, low risk, but intelligence was wrong. We walked into a trap, coordinated resistance that caught us completely off guard." Sarah listened intently, hungry for details that might help her understand Tony's final moments. "When the shooting started, Tony's unit was separated from the main force," Jake continued. "They took cover in a partially collapsed building while we tried to establish a perimeter. That's when the explosion happened." Jake paused, wrestling with how much detail to share. The truth was that Tony had seen the incoming rocket-propelled grenade before anyone else, had shouted warnings while throwing himself across two wounded teammates. His body had absorbed shrapnel meant for others, bought them precious seconds to find better cover. But explaining those details would also mean describing the aftermath, the desperate medical evacuation, the fight to save lives that were already lost. "Tony saw danger before the rest of his team did," Jake said finally. "He put himself between that danger and the people he was responsible for protecting. It was instinctive, immediate. He didn't think about it, he just acted." Sarah absorbed this information, trying to reconcile the heroic narrative with her memory of the brother who'd been afraid of spiders and cried during sad movies. But the more she thought about it, the more sense it made. Tony had always been protective, always willing to take hits for other people's mistakes. Military service had simply given him a larger stage for the same fundamental character. "Was he in pain?" she asked quietly. Jake shook his head. "It was very quick. He was unconscious within seconds. The medics did everything possible, but the injuries were too severe." It wasn't the complete truth, but it was true enough. Tony had been conscious long enough to ask about his teammates, to make sure they were receiving medical attention before him. He died knowing that his sacrifice had worked, that the people he'd protected were going to survive. Jake thought Sarah deserved to know about Tony's heroism, but not about his final moments of pain and fear. "Thank you," Sarah said simply, "for being honest, for not making it sound easy or romantic." They spent the next hour talking about Tony's personality during deployment, his relationships with other soldiers, his plans for after-military service. Jake painted a picture of a young man who'd matured rapidly under pressure, who'd earned respect through competence and kindness, who'd been genuinely excited about returning home to reconnect with his sister. "He had this idea," Jake said as their conversation wound down, "about starting a nonprofit organization, something to help military families transition back to civilian life. He said you taught him that education was the key to everything, that he wanted to create opportunities for other veterans to go to school." Sarah felt tears threatening again. It sounded exactly like Tony, always thinking about how to help other people, always believing in the power of second chances and hard work. "I applied for graduate school again," she admitted suddenly. "For next fall. I used Tony's GI Bill benefits, they transfer to family members, but I keep feeling guilty about it, like I'm profiting from his death." Jake leaned forward, his expression intense. "Sarah, listen to me. Tony's GI Bill benefits exist precisely so his death wouldn't be meaningless. Using them to pursue your dreams isn't profiting from tragedy, it's honoring his sacrifice. It's making sure his investment in your future pays the dividends he hoped for." The conversation continued until sunset painted the harbor in shades of orange and pink. As they prepared to part ways, Jake hesitated, then reached into his jacket pocket. "One more thing," he said, producing a small plastic bag containing military dog tags. "These are Tony's personal tags, not his official ones. He had them made with a custom inscription." Sarah took the bag with shaking hands. The tags looked identical to standard military identification, but when she turned them over, she found Tony's personal message engraved on the back. "For Sarah, follow your dreams." "He ordered them about a month before he died," Jake explained. "Said if anything happened to him, his sister needed to remember that someone believed in her completely." Sarah clutched the tags, overwhelmed by the depth of Tony's preparation for his own death. He'd spent his final months arranging for her future, creating messages and gifts that would survive his absence. The love represented by such planning was almost too much to process. "I don't know how to thank you," she said through tears, "for keeping these things, for bringing them to me, for helping me understand." Jake stood up, shouldering the now empty duffel bag. "Tony would have done the same for my family. That's how it works in the military. We take care of each other's people." As they walked toward the parking area, Sarah felt something shifting inside her chest, a loosening of grief that had been locked tight for 8 months. The items in her bag represented more than memories. They were evidence of Tony's continued presence in her life, proof that love could survive death and distance. "Jake," she called as he reached his truck, "would you like to have dinner sometime? I mean to talk more about Tony and maybe other things." Jake turned back with a smile that transformed his entire face. "I'd like that very much, but only if you promise to tell me about your research, your plans for school, all the things Tony was proud of." As Sarah drove home that evening, Tony's letter unopened on her passenger seat, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months: excitement about the future. Whatever revelations awaited in Tony's final letter, whatever dreams she'd abandoned in grief, whatever possibilities she'd forgotten in the struggle just to survive, everything felt reachable again. The ocean stretched endlessly beyond the harbor, full of mysteries waiting to be discovered by someone brave enough to dive deep. For the first time since Tony's death, Sarah remembered what it felt like to want to explore those depths, to believe she had something valuable to contribute to the world he'd died protecting. Sarah waited until Sunday morning to read Tony's letter. She made coffee, settled into the window seat overlooking her small apartment's view of the bay, and carefully opened the envelope that had traveled across the world to reach her. The letter was 12 pages long, written in sections over several weeks. Tony's handwriting evolved throughout, sometimes rushed during stolen moments, sometimes carefully formed during quiet evenings. Each page was dated, creating a timeline of his thoughts during what would be his final month of life. The first section was vintage Tony, apologizing for the dramatic nature of a posthumous letter while insisting it was just insurance, not prophecy. He wrote about the beauty of the country where he was stationed, the kindness of local people, the satisfaction of meaningful work. But gradually, the tone shifted to more serious matters. "Sarah, I need you to know that everything I'm doing here makes sense because you exist. When people ask why we serve, why we put ourselves in danger for strangers, the answer is always about protecting something precious. You're my something precious. Your brilliant mind, your kind heart, your dreams about saving the ocean, all of it is worth protecting." Sarah paused reading, overwhelmed by the intensity of Tony's love. He'd always been proud of her accomplishments, but she'd never realized the depth of his investment in her future success. The letter continued with practical matters. Tony had researched graduate programs in marine biology, identified scholarships she might not have known about, even contacted professors at universities he thought she should consider. He'd been planning her academic future with the same thoroughness he applied to military operations. "I know you think you're not smart enough for the big schools, but you're wrong. Doctor at UC San specifically looks for students with non-traditional backgrounds. I already emailed her about you, sorry for meddling, but someone has to push you to think bigger. She said your undergraduate research on coral reef restoration was exactly what her lab needs." Sarah nearly dropped the letter. Doctor was a legend in marine biology, someone Sarah had admired from afar but never dreamed of approaching. The idea that Tony had contacted her directly was both mortifying and thrilling. The middle sections of the letter revealed a side of Tony that Sarah had never seen. He wrote about his fears, his responsibility for the younger soldiers in his unit, his struggle to balance aggression necessary for survival with the compassion that made him human. He described watching teammates grow up too quickly, learning to compartmentalize trauma while still feeling everything deeply. I used to think courage meant not being scared, but that's wrong. Real courage is being terrified and doing the right thing anyway. You've always had that kind of courage, Sarah. When Dad left, when Mom got sick, when money was tight and dreams seemed impossible, you kept moving forward anyway. That's the kind of strength that changes the world. Sarah realized she was crying again, but these tears felt different. Instead of the hollow grief that had dominated her emotions for months, she felt a complex mixture of sadness and pride and determination. Tony's words were giving her permission to see herself the way he'd always seen her, capable of extraordinary things. The final sections of the letter were the most difficult to read. Tony wrote about premonitions, dreams that felt like warnings, a growing sense that his deployment might not end with a safe return home. He wasn't being dramatic or fatalistic. He was simply acknowledging the mathematical reality of military service in dangerous places. If you're reading this, it means something happened to me. I'm sorry, Sarah. Sorry for leaving you alone. Sorry for breaking the promise I made to always come home. Sorry for adding to the grief you've already survived. But I need you to promise me something in return. The promise Tony requested was both simple and overwhelming. He wanted Sarah to live not just her own dreams, but the dreams he would never get to pursue. The nonprofit organization for military families, the advanced education he'd planned for after service, the family he'd hoped to raise someday, the contributions he'd wanted to make to the world. I don't mean you should become someone else. I mean you should become the fullest version of yourself, the person who changes things because she refuses to accept that problems are permanent. Use my GI Bill benefits. Apply to those graduate programs. Take risks I'll never get to take. Fall in love with someone who deserves you. Have the adventures we used to plan together. Sarah set the letter down temporarily, overwhelmed by the weight of Tony's expectations. He was asking her to live two lives, to carry his unrealized potential along with her own. The responsibility felt enormous but also clarifying. For months, she'd been stuck in grief, paralyzed by loss. Tony was giving her a different framework, grief as fuel for bigger dreams, love as motivation for bolder action. The letter concluded with specific instructions. Tony had set up a small trust fund using his military savings, money designated specifically for Sarah's education. He'd also written letters of recommendation to 3 professors, describing her potential in terms that made her sound like a future Nobel Prize winner. I know you'll try to refuse this help because you've always been too proud to accept charity. But this isn't charity, it's an investment. I'm betting everything I have on your success because I believe in you completely. Don't let me down, Dr. Martinez. The final page was different from the rest, written in Tony's most careful handwriting. It was a list of 23 specific goals he'd wanted to accomplish after military service, ranging from learning to surf to earning a graduate degree to traveling through Europe. Next to each goal, he'd written Sarah's name. These dreams don't have to die with me. Pick the ones that sound interesting, modify them however you want, and make them happen. Every adventure you take, every risk you embrace, every dream you pursue is a victory over the circumstances that took me away from you. Sarah finished reading as afternoon sunlight streamed through her apartment windows. The letter felt like a conversation with Tony, as if he were sitting across from her explaining his vision for her future. The grief wasn't gone, but it had been transformed into something more productive, determination to honor his memory by becoming the person he'd believed she could be. That evening, she called Jake. Their dinner plans had been tentative, undefined, but Sarah now had specific purposes in mind. She needed to understand more about Tony's dreams, needed help translating his military experience into civilian action, needed someone who'd shared his vision of service and sacrifice. I read the letter, she said when Jake answered. All of it, and I have ideas. They met at a restaurant overlooking the harbor, the same water where Sarah had once planned to study marine ecosystems before Tony's death derailed her ambitions. Over dinner, she shared Tony's vision for a nonprofit organization, his research into educational programs for military families, his belief that her scientific background could contribute to veteran services. He saw connections I never would have imagined, Sarah explained, showing Jake copies of Tony's notes. Environmental restoration projects that could provide job training for veterans, research programs that could address PTSD through outdoor therapy, educational initiatives that could help military families understand their benefits. Jake listened with growing excitement. As a career military officer, he'd seen countless programs that promised to help veterans but failed because they were designed by bureaucrats who'd never served. Tony's vision was different, comprehensive, practical, designed by someone who understood both military culture and civilian realities. "This could actually work," Jake said finally. "But it would require serious commitment, probably years of development before you'd see results." Sarah nodded, thinking about the 23 dreams on Tony's list, the trust fund he'd established, the professors who were expecting her application. "I've been thinking about that. What if I applied to graduate programs that would support this kind of work? Environmental science with a focus on therapeutic applications, business administration with nonprofit emphasis, public policy with military specialization." Over the following weeks, Sarah threw herself into planning with an energy she hadn't felt in months. She researched universities, reached out to the professors Tony had contacted, began sketching organizational structures for the nonprofit he'd envisioned. Jake became an invaluable collaborator, providing military perspective and practical insights that shaped her developing proposals. The more they worked together, the more Sarah realized that her attraction to Jake was evolving beyond their shared connection to Tony. He was intelligent, dedicated, surprisingly funny when he relaxed his professional demeanor. More importantly, he understood the weight of carrying other people's dreams, the responsibility that came with surviving when others didn't. Their relationship developed slowly, carefully, built on mutual respect and shared purpose rather than convenience or loneliness. Sarah was determined not to use Jake as a replacement for Tony, and Jake was equally careful not to position himself as Sarah's salvation from grief. Instead, they became partners in honoring Tony's memory while building something new together. 6 months after their first meeting, Sarah received acceptance letters from 3 graduate programs, along with fellowship offers that would cover her expenses for the next 4 years. Doctor at UC, San was particularly enthusiastic, describing research opportunities that perfectly aligned with Tony's vision of environmental work supporting veteran services. Sarah accepted the offer, but not before making a proposal that surprised everyone involved. She wanted to structure her graduate research around developing the nonprofit organization Tony had envisioned, using her doctoral dissertation to create a comprehensive model for veteran services that addressed environmental, educational, and therapeutic needs simultaneously. "It's ambitious," Doctor admitted during their planning meeting. "Possibly too ambitious for a traditional dissertation, but if you're willing to do the work, we're willing to support the innovation." The nonprofit organization launched 2 years later, with Sarah as executive director and Jake as military liaison. They called it Second Missions, reflecting Tony's belief that military service prepared veterans for important civilian work rather than simply ending with discharge. The organization provided environmental job training, therapeutic outdoor programs, and educational support for military families to civilian life. The wooden jewelry box Tony had carved sat on Sarah's desk throughout graduate school, holding the dog tags he'd had made with their encouraging inscription. Sometimes, during long nights of writing grant proposals or analyzing research data, she would touch the smooth surface Tony had created and remember his belief in her potential. Sarah completed her doctorate in 4 years, producing a dissertation that became the foundation for veteran services programs in 6 states. Her research proved that environmental restoration work provided measurable mental health benefits for veterans with PTSD, while also creating valuable conservation outcomes and job training opportunities. At her graduation ceremony, Sarah wore a dress that revealed her memorial tattoo completely for the first time. The design had evolved over the years, with new elements added to commemorate milestones Tony would never see. Her graduation, the nonprofit's success, her engagement to Jake, the future they were building together. Jake proposed on the anniversary of their first meeting, at the same picnic table in park where he'd given her Tony's belongings. The ring was simple, elegant, engraved with coordinates marking the location where Tony had died. It was a way of including him in their future, acknowledging that their love had grown from shared loss and mutual commitment to honoring his memory. Their wedding was small, attended mostly by military colleagues and fellow nonprofit workers who understood the significance of building joy on the foundation of sacrifice. Sarah carried Tony's dog tags in her bouquet, a physical reminder that love could survive death and distance, that dreams deferred didn't have to become dreams abandoned. During her wedding toast, Sarah spoke about second chances and unexpected connections, about the way grief could become fuel for growth if you were brave enough to transform pain into purpose. She thanked Tony for introducing her to Jake, even though he'd done it posthumously and accidentally, through the simple act of remembering to honor the people who mattered most. 5 years after that first meeting in the coffee shop, Sarah stood on the deck of a research vessel in Monterey Bay, preparing to dive into waters she dreamed of exploring since childhood. Her work with second missions had led to a collaboration with the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute, studying how kelp forest restoration could provide therapeutic benefits for veterans while also addressing climate change impacts on marine ecosystems. As she adjusted her diving equipment, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought her from a coffee shop near a military base to the deck of a research vessel. Tony's dog tags hung around her neck, tucked safely inside her wetsuit. His carved box sat on her office desk back at the university, still holding the original tags along with mementos from adventures he'd never got to take but had somehow experienced through her choices. The water was cold and clear, exactly the kind of environment where Tony had imagined his sister would do her most important work. As Sarah descended toward the kelp forest, surrounded by the underwater cathedral he'd helped her return to, she carried his dreams along with her own into the depths where mysteries waited to be solved and futures waited to be created. Above the surface, Jake monitored her dive from the research vessel, ready to support whatever discoveries she might make below. Their partnership had proven that love could grow from shared loss, that two people carrying the same grief could help each other transform it into something generative and lasting. In the end, Sarah had kept every promise Tony had asked for in his final letter. She'd pursued the biggest dreams, taken the greatest risks, lived not just her own life, but the life he'd never got to complete. But more than that, she'd learned that honoring the dead didn't require becoming someone else. It required becoming the fullest version of yourself, the person your loved ones had always believed you could be. The ocean stretched endlessly around her, full of mysteries and possibilities, just as Tony had known it would be. And in the depths where light filtered down through kelp fronds like cathedral windows, Sarah continued the work of discovery, carrying love and loss and hope down into the places where new life was always beginning.